Good evening, and welcome to Democracy Dialogues. My name is Gail Sunderman. Democracy Dialogues is an initiative of the League of Women Voters of Maryland. Our aim is to provide our members and the public with nonpartisan information on a range of issues and to examine their impact on Marylanders. Tonight, we will be talking about voting and your rights. We're so glad that you're joining us. Before I introduce tonight's guest, I would like to say a word about the League of Women Voters of Maryland. First, please consider becoming a member of the League. It's easy and we would welcome your involvement. The link to join is in the chat. Second, this is an election season. Just a reminder in case you forgot. Early voting in Maryland starts next week, Thursday on June 11th, and primary election day is June 23rd. Mail-in voting is already underway. So if you want information about voting and want to know about candidates running in your district, information is available on our website. Again, links are in the chat. And please remember, vote 411, which you can put into a search engine and it will take you to voter guides. Tonight, we're pleased to have three experts on voting rights. Debbie Jeon is the legal director for ACLU Maryland, where she leads the organization's work on civil rights advocacy and voting rights. She began her ACLU career in 1990 on the Maryland's Eastern Shore. In both positions, she has led landmark cases that have transformed Maryland law on voting rights, racial profiling, and accountability. She is a graduate of Yale Law School and Cornell University, and she currently serves on the Maryland Attorney General's Civil Rights Advisory Council. Also with us is Katherine Berry, who was appointed as Deputy State Administrator of the Maryland State Board of Elections in September 2023. Katherine began her career in elections working part-time for the Carroll County Board of Elections while she was a student at McDaniel College. Once she graduated, she became a full-time employee and in 2015 became the county's election director. Prior to her appointment to the State Board of Elections, she served for 9 years as the legislative liaison to the Maryland General Assembly for the Maryland Association of Election Officials. Braden Stinar is a staff attorney at Disability Rights Maryland, which is a nonprofit organization that advocates for the civil rights of people with disabilities. It is the state's designated protection and advocacy agency. Braden was admitted to the Maryland Bar in 2023, and his work focuses on protecting and expanding voting rights, as well as removing barriers to employment for Marylanders with disabilities. Moderating our discussion tonight is Nikki Tyree, the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Maryland. Before we start, please put your questions in the chat. The way to do this is to select New Chat and then direct it to Nikki. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the programs. Questions can be directed to any of our guests. So let's get started. Thank you for attending. Nikki, it's all yours.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. So I wanted to take a second to set the table for what you can expect tonight. And as Gail was saying, this is a major election year in Maryland, and the questions arriving in our inboxes reflect real anxiety. People are reading things online, hearing things at the grocery store, and wondering what's actually true. Tonight is not about alarm, it's about clarity. We've brought together three people who work inside these systems every day because an informed voter is the most powerful person in a democracy. We don't want anyone to walk away from the polls or away from their ballot because they were confused or intimidated. We want to meet people where they are, address what they're hearing out there, and give them the ground, factual answers they deserve. So before we get started, we understand that there has been a lot of conversation around the mail-in ballot. And while mail-in ballots is not exclusively what tonight is about, Katherine Berry from the State Board of Elections has agreed to take 2 minutes at the top to discuss this issue. So Katie, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Nikki. Good evening, everyone. So as you may be aware by now, that on May 14th, SBE was made aware of an error by our mail-in ballot vendor, and it resulted in some voters receiving the wrong party ballot for the primary election. This error only affects those that were mailed ballots before May 14th. And this is also a result. The result was over 400,000 people being impacted, including those that were permanent mail-in voters and those that were UOCAVA voters. So if someone requested a web delivery ballot, their ballot was not affected. Ultimately, the decision was made to send replacement ballots to all of those that were affected. And those replacement ballots went in the mail between May 22nd and May 28th. So at this point, most every voter should have received their replacement ballot. All affected voters were notified by postcard beginning May 18th. We have sent a variety of emails and text messages, press statements, letting people know that they need a replacement ballot or their replacement ballot was on the way. And as of today, we are starting to transition to sending notices to people who have returned an original ballot to make sure that they return their replacement ballot. We are continuing to work with the vendor to identify the root cause. However, SBE does recognize that it is possible that only a small number of voters receive the wrong ballot. Most voters probably received the correct ballot, but because it was impossible to know at a very critical time, that is why the decision was made to issue replacement ballots. We are working tirelessly to respond to every email and phone call that comes in. And within a 10-day period, we fielded almost 4,000 phone calls and nearly 2,000 emails that we have responded to. So we are working closely with the local boards to ensure that we have a streamlined process procedurally to manage this in the canvas. And so to be clear, SBE is continuing to utilize practices that prevent voters from having more than one ballot counted. As with all facets of the electoral process, there are additional safeguards to ensure that only the correct ballot is being counted for each voter. So just some final thoughts and things that we need your help to educate the voters on. For voters that received an original ballot, they should destroy the ballot. They need to vote the entitled replacement ballot and also return that replacement ballot before 8 p.m. on June 23rd. It can be taken to a drop box, a polling location, early voting center, a local board of elections, or postmarked and put into the mail. So with that, thank you, Nikki, for allowing me to speak on that, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Katie. So for now, I'm going to turn it over to Braden Stinar from Disability Rights Maryland, where he is going to discuss your rights at the polls when it comes to physical and intellectual disabilities. And we look forward to any questions, and please feel free to send them to me in the chat, and Braden will answer them at the end. Braden, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Nikki. And big thank you to the League of Women Voters for having me join this evening. I'm happy to share a bit about, the ADA, the Help America Vote Act, and the accessibility requirements for in-person voting, as well as mail-in ballot drop boxes across the state. So I'm sure, we're all aware, have some general awareness of the Americans with Disabilities Act and how that might affect polling locations or, access to federal buildings more generally. But there are some very specific requirements for both ballot drop boxes as well as physical polling locations that I just want to make sure voters are aware of as we get closer and closer to the primary election and then the general election again in November. And so just to highlight kind of those big ticket items that are really important to look for and to make sure that we're taking advantage of that are available to us. Are just to start our parking spaces that are clearly marked, accessible parking spaces. So those are clearly marked with the handicap sign that we can think of. And those are required to be at every polling location with clear signage indicating where they are. Another requirement of physical polling locations are accessible paths of travel from those parking areas to either the polling place itself or the ballot drop box. And so that would require curb cutouts when necessary, and things of that nature, just to make sure that there's a clear physical path of travel without any encumbrances or anything getting in the way of someone using a wheelchair or any other mobility device to get to the accessible entrance. And so with that, there's also an accessibility requirement for the entrances of buildings as well. So those entrances must be accessible under the ADA, so that features, the handicap door access that can open, as well as a wide distance enough to fit, wheelchair access or other mobility devices to get through those doorways. And there must also be signage, indicating exactly how to access that entrance, where it is to the building, in case there are maybe multiple entrances into the polling location. There must be a specific accessible entrance, and that should be clearly marked for voters to, be easily able to find and navigate to. And another requirement of polling places are seating for voters that might need assistance and waiting while they're waiting in line, in case there are long lines on election day or lines even during the early voting process. If you're a voter that needs, a place card holder or someone to hold your spot while you wait to your turn, you can request that support from the election judges or poll workers when you arrive at the polling location. And they'll provide you with a placeholder card that you can then give to your support person or to the family or friend or individual that you brought with you to hold your place in line while you sit and wait your turn. And that person will do exactly like I said, just wait in line till it's your turn to vote, and then notify you, and you'll be able to come up and vote at that time. And that kind of brings me to another really important highlight is the assistance by person of choice. And so very generally, what that means is that all voters are able to bring an individual of their choice, a family, a friend, a coworker, or support person to provide assistance through all aspects of the voting process. So that could take the form of, assisting you with physically filling out your ballot itself, reading the ballot, marking it, marking the selections, gaining an understanding for what the questions are on the ballot or who the candidates are. And as well as, transportation to and from the polling place. And so that, that person, that support person can be physically in there with you, helping you fill out that ballot, helping you work through the questions on the accessible ballot marking device if you chose to use that device to vote. But really all aspects of the voting process, you're allowed to have, assistance by a person of choice through that experience. And so that's another really, really important piece for voters with disabilities or voters who might need just some extra support with filling out the ballot. It is available to you, and you can request that assistance, not just from a family, a friend, or a caregiver, but also from the election judges or poll workers that are there on site as well. And those individuals can, provide support with that process. I also want to highlight that thanks to the Help America Vote Act, every polling place in the state of Maryland is required to have an accessible ballot marking device. And I'm sure, we're all fairly familiar with what that looks like at this point, but it's that assistive technology device. It's sort of a bit larger than an iPad, and it allows voters to use the touch screen of it to vote their ballots, as well as you can change the color contrast. You can change the font size of your ballot. You can plug in headphones that they will have on site for you to use if necessary, to use an audio description of the ballot to work through your selections. It's also accessible for use with a sip and puff device, and the device can also be raised or lowered to meet your accessibility needs, whether that is placed on your lap or even just the table, raised or lowered, depending upon your height, standing or sitting at that time. And what's cool about this device is it's not just only available to voters with disabilities. I highly recommend, all voters that have the time, if there's not a long line to use it, to please request to use the device for a couple reasons. One is because it prints out a slightly different looking ballot than your traditional paper ballot that you'd fill out by hand. And so for the more and more voters that use this ballot marking device and have print out the slightly different ballot, it makes it harder for folks to discern, if there's a certain population that are using that device and which way they may be voting. And so another thing that's really helpful is if voters that don't have disabilities request to use the device, this just makes sure that the election judge and the poll workers, know how to operate the device more generally and that it's on and available for use at each polling location. Because we want to make sure, obviously, that if a voter comes along with a disability who might really need that device to have access to the ballot box, that it's there and that it's on and that the election judges are aware of how to support voters with using it. And so, like I said, if there's not a long line or a long wait to use it, it's really good to request to use the device regardless of whether you have a disability. And it's just a nice, helpful, accessible tool that makes the voting process, really easy and streamlined. And so I highly recommend, if you haven't experienced using it before, to please ask when you go to vote during the early voting season or during on election day. Some other really, I kind of want to turn now to what Nikki had hinted at, and that's some questions about guardianship or intellectual disability. And so we receive a lot of questions about this as Disability Rights Maryland is out, doing voter registration work in the community. And that question is really, how might a guardianship order affect my right to vote? Or how might, my intellectual disability affect my right to vote? And to clarify just really clearly, in Maryland, under Maryland law, if an individual is under a guardianship order or an individual has a guardian, another way to say that, that does not automatically revoke your right to vote. You do not automatically lose your right to vote. And so to remove an individual's right to vote based upon intellectual capacity or under a guardianship order that requires a separate court determination, that individual can't communicate with or without accommodations the desire to vote. And that's exceedingly rare that happens. So that's why I open up with just clarifying, that the guardianship order does not automatically revoke your right to vote. And so if you're an individual out there, who is under guardianship or has an intellectual disability, there isn't anything that should stand in your way of voting, not a poll worker, an election judge, or a family or friend. If you have the desire to vote, please go to a polling location, try to register to vote with your local or state board of election, and cast your ballot on election day. And so it's just really important to highlight, again, that an election judge, poll worker, or family or friend, they can't determine that right to vote for you, especially not in the moment. If you were ever met with questions about your capacity while at the polls, it's just really, really important to highlight that isn't what should happen. And that would be a great time to reach out to someone like myself to raise that concern up the chain and make sure that you're able to vote on time and that your ballot is counted. And so with that, if there are any barriers, that voters may run into with access issues or capacity issues or questions about eligibility or status to vote, please reach out to myself at Disability Rights Maryland. And I'd love to hear more about barriers you've experienced in the past or, concerns that you have going into this election cycle. That way we're able to provide some support, some advice, and get out in front of any problems that might pop up. So I just want to thank Nikki again and the League of Women Voters for having me just to share this brief information for you. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that folks may have at the end. And I'll turn that back over to Nikki.
Thanks, Braden. I already have questions for you, so definitely stick around. For now, I am going to bring Katie and Katherine and Debbie back up on the screen, and we will have a moderated discussion about your rights at the polls. So the first thing I want to kick off is probably one of the things that here in Maryland we've been hearing the most about, which is ICE or federal troops at the polls. I would love to hear both of your perspectives on it. What are your individual organizations, agencies doing to prep for it? And what can voters and Good Samaritans do to prep for this as well? Katie, why don't you start?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I think that it's really important to note that our local boards take monitoring the safety, security of election judges, voters, very seriously for, people that are electioneering outside the early voting centers and at polling places. And they also work with local law enforcement if there's ever an issue. So there's no legal authority for law enforcement to, get custody of ballots or be inside a polling place. And specifically, federal law enforcement are not permitted to be actively involved or around election processes. If voters observe any activity involving federal agents, whether it be within the 100-foot no electioneering zone or outside of the electioneering zone, they need to immediately let the chief judges know inside the polling places or early voting centers, or call the local board of elections, so that we can take immediate action following, the guidance that we receive as well. So it's just really important that, it's kind of like, if you see something, say something motto, and that way we are aware of what's going on out in all the early voting centers and polling places. So I'll turn it over to Debbie. Do you have anything?
Thank you. And it is true that this is probably the thing that we're hearing the most, is fear that ICE is going to descend on the polls. But it is really that absolutely should not be happening, because federal law makes it illegal for the federal government to deploy armed agents to polling places for the purpose of interfering with your right to vote. It just should not happen, and I don't think that there's the same level of concern that state or local police are going to engage in that kind of conduct. It's really just a concern about ICE, and to the extent that I've heard people wonder about what if they are setting up roadblocks or doing something outside the polling place in order to try to catch people in that way. There are we're fortunate to have multiple ways to vote, and so like if that is something that people are really concerned about, they can vote by mail. Or vote, early when there's multiple options of where you can go, and you can avoid any kind of concern about that. But it just shouldn't happen, and I think we are all going to be very vigilant in making sure that it doesn't.
Thanks. I think that kind of leads us into something that we've been talking a lot about, which I think each of you kind of lends a unique perspective to, which is what is in voter intimidation, right? So I know State Board of Elections is following AG guidelines of here's what, we define it as. Whereas Debbie, I know as one of the advocates, we have a broader definition of what we would consider voter intimidation. Can both of you explain to our audience, what is voter intimidation from your perspective, and then what it isn't also, and what do voters or election protection Good Samaritans do in that instance when they believe they are witnessing voter intimidation?
Debbie, did you want to start that one?
Well, I can say, we the obvious definition is that it can come in many forms. It could be by a private citizen, a partisan poll watcher, or law enforcement. But again, Maryland law, federal law prohibit tactics that are used to intimidate, threaten, or coerce voters in any way that suppresses their participation. What some examples of things we've seen in the past, spreading false information about what the voter requirements are, or what when you're supposed to vote in order to try to deter people from voting, use of visible association with hate group symbols like Confederate flags, for example, where just intended to drive people away, sort of staking out an area outside a poll with military garb and questioning people about what their qualifications are to vote, who they're going to vote for. All kinds of different conduct can constitute voter intimidation. It's really like how it affects the person. But Katie, I think that the way to get around it is to rely on our local election officials who are very vigilant about preventing intimidation.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's really if a voter is feeling very uncomfortable over a situation that is going on, whether it's in the polling place, outside the polling place, but like they should be notifying the local board of elections. And whether it's really contextual to figure out, like what is actually going to be considered intimidation, but things like verbal threats, violent behavior, confronting voters in an aggressive manner, harassing voters. Those are the types of things that we kind of monitor and really hone in on closely as local election officials will in person locations.
During the election protection hotlines and sort of monitoring of polls, the ACLU and League and other Common Cause, all the advocates work together very closely with the state board and making sure that these kinds of incidents are addressed so that we can prevent as much intimidation as possible.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because one of the things that I had come up, this past session when we were talking about voter intimidation and is that this idea of election judges asking voters to vote provisionally was somehow a form of voter intimidation and a tactic. So, Katie, could you talk a little bit about what provisional ballots are, what they're not, and how maybe I'm biased at being asked to vote a provisional ballot is not a form of voter intimidation?
Or So provisional ballots came out of, I believe, HAVA in the early 2000s to ensure that anyone who comes into a polling place is given the right and the ability to vote. And so what this essentially turns into is allowing a voter to cast a ballot. And then on the back end, the local election officials determine with the board of canvassers if that ballot should be accepted or rejected. And so provisional ballots are, focused on the people who maybe had a change of address. They didn't update their address before election day. Actually today is the change of registration deadline for pre-election time. If a person wants to vote a different party ballot than what they are registered, if they have tried to register for same-day registration and they did not provide the information that is required. So all of these things are required under the law as a provisional ballot. And it does not mean that the ballot won't get counted. There are, like I said, lots of circumstances where ballots are counted. They just have to go through a couple more checks and balances and to make sure that that voter is eligible to cast ballot. So if an election judge is asking a voter to cast a provisional ballot, one of two things has occurred. Either the electronic poll book has told the election judge that this person is not eligible to vote a regular ballot, or the election judge is not able to locate the individual in the voter registration records. So it is a somewhat tedious process. You have to fill out a provisional ballot application. Your ballot goes into the envelope with the provisional ballot application. And those ballots are counted 8 days after election day. Or I shouldn't say counted, but canvassed, and then either counted or rejected 8 days after election day. You can have this, anyone can help you to fill in your provisional ballot. It can be two election officials at the polling place. It can be someone that you bring with you if you need assistance. And like I said, the provisional ballots are canvassed and they go through a very, very detailed process. The votes also remain a secret. They are treated in a canvas like a mail-in ballot, whereby the envelope and the identifying information is separated from the ballot before it is scanned. So it is all safe and secure for people's secrecy of the ballot.
Perfect. So I want to change the tide a little bit here and ask both of you, if anybody on the call in our audience was watching the last 5 minutes of legislative session back in April, they would have seen that both of us, advocates and SBE alike, had bills as the last two bills that made it across the finish line. Debbie, you were like the most instrumental. You and Dara from Dara is a coworker of Debbie's at ACLU, were some of the most instrumental advocates in getting the Voting Rights Act passed. And Katie, State Board of Elections worked really hard to get the misinformation and disinformation bill across the finish line. Can both of you talk about why, in an age of hearing so often that these bills aren't necessary in a place like Maryland, why these bills were critical to the state?
Debbie,
my
would you like to
gosh.
start?
The the MDVRA, the Maryland Voting Rights Act, it's been years in the making, but just in the nick of time. It's a landmark law that was enacted this session just at midnight on Sine Die, by the legislature to outlaw vote dilution in local elections. And it was signed into law the following month by Governor Moore, and then the next day, the U.S. Supreme Court gutted the Federal Voting Rights Act, which is what had been feared by so many people for so long, and one of the reasons that there was such an intensive push to get the MDVRA across the finish line this year, because now that, sort of the only path forward for Marylanders in protecting against vote dilution is going to be through the MDVRA. And so we're so grateful that it was passed, and really just thank everyone who played a part in it.
Thanks. And as far as the mis and disinformation bill, I think this is one of the up and coming issues that we have with artificial intelligence and just so much information that is coming out on social media and in, just all kinds of reports that we're seeing online. And so this is enabling legislation really so that when we get credible information that something is not correct, there are processes in place for us to take a legal action toward whatever the deep fake misinformation or the disinformation that's out there. So it was something, it was I think near and dear to the state administrator's heart here. So we worked, in tandem with a lot of other stakeholders to make sure that we are able to protect the voting process in this way. And I think this is the most critical thing because now, the internet is just everywhere. So thanks, Nikki.
Yeah, it does seem strange to talk about these two pieces of legislation, but I think people forget that knowing your rights as a voter really does kind of start at home, and you have that right to not be bombarded by misinformation, and you have a right for your vote to not be diluted, right? And so I do think those were critical to sort of talk about. So again, changing topics, it seems there's so much to talk about. A couple of weeks ago, I was with some friends, and one of them said that there's information going around right now that incarcerated people are not allowed to vote, and that if you've ever served time in a facility, that you aren't permitted to vote. So I want to start with Debbie. If you could just once and for all clear the rumors and tell us what, if you have been incarcerated, if you are currently incarcerated, what are your rights? And then Katie, if you want to come in and explain what SBE is doing and has done to help that community of people make sure that they have the same access that everybody else does.
So the law on this has just improved dramatically in Maryland over the last 25 years, thanks to the leadership from the Expand the Ballot Coalition, Out for Justice, Life After Release, and the Maryland Justice Project. But at this point, the rules are very simple. The only people ineligible to vote are those currently incarcerated, serving a sentence of incarceration for a felony. Everyone else can vote. That means everyone not currently incarcerated can vote. Whether or not they're on parole doesn't matter. And anyone in jail, pre-trial or just for a misdemeanor, can vote. So it's really wide open, and the concerns of the past, when there really were some rules that prohibited people from being able to vote if they had a record, those are gone, and so it's just those who are incarcerated currently for a felony are the only ones who cannot vote.
Yeah, and we have made the ability to register and vote super easy, I think, with all of our facilities here in Maryland. We have drop boxes at all of the facilities. People that go to those drop boxes on a daily basis to check if there are applications or ballots. We also have, I guess, a special set of messaging and ads and commercials that are played at those facilities as well. So we have a very strong partnership, and we actually have an employee now at the State Board of Elections who visits the facilities as well and goes to job fairs and that type of thing. So yeah, we work closely with the facilities and then with all of the league and the ACLU Common Cause on this.
Perfect. So before we get to questions, I do want to follow up with you guys about some of the federal things that we can anticipate. There has been a lot of rumors out there about the voter rolls, which I know ACLU is involved in a lawsuit on that one. There are rumors about the postmark issues that are going on. And of course, now there is just so much conversation about the federal administration coming in to seize our ballots. So if, no particular order, but if there was just kind of a free flow conversation between you two of what you're seeing from the federal level, what has Maryland done to protect voters, and then what's true and what's not true.
So at the state board and at the local boards, of course, we're monitoring all legal matters closely. We have our own, state legal matters as well as the federal issues. And in my 20 years working in elections, this is the first time that we seem to have a lot of federal legislation and conversations that are going on. So it is kind of a unique time. Outside of HAVA, that was before my time. So one of the things that I would love to assure everyone about is with regards to the post office in Maryland and the Washington area. We have a especially strong relationship with our postal service here in Maryland. We have all local boards have a specific contact at their local post office. We have regular conversations with people at the Baltimore office and the Washington office from the State Board of Elections. And so they do give a lot of special attention to ballots that they recognize coming through the mail. We've educated enough to show what a web delivery ballot might look like if the template isn't used. And so they really pay special attention to what is going on. And so I just encourage everyone, however you want to get your ballot back to us, but just get it done early. Make sure the ballots come in before June 23rd. We recognize that not every ballot will have a postmark on it, and it's always been that way. And so that's something and a reason why we have a local board of canvassers that makes decisions about these types of things. And so I don't want anybody to feel like they are not able to vote a mail-in ballot because of something that is going on, federally, or something that the post office said. But that's why we have all the options, right? We have, you can come in person, drop it off. You can go to a drop box. You can use the mail, and we will get it. So I think that's my biggest message. We're just monitoring. We will, push out information as quickly as we can. If we have to pivot and make changes before the general election, we will do that in a transparent way to make sure that we educate everyone to the best of our ability.
I'll just say a little bit about the voter rolls issue, which is that last year the Trump Justice Department demanded that Maryland hand over voters' names, addresses, dates of birth, driver's license numbers, social security numbers, data that's protected by both state and federal law. And of course, the state Board of Elections declined to provide the unredacted information, leading to a lawsuit in federal court by the Justice Department, federal court in Baltimore. This is not an isolated case. It's similar lawsuits have been filed by the Justice Department in, I think, a total of 30 states, starting with all the blue states, which have been a particular focus. The concern is that DOJ wants this data to weaponize it against certain voters, specifically. They've suggested that they're going to build a national voter database that they can use for purges and for in collaboration with the Department of Homeland Security to target people. The state is fighting very hard again, fighting back against the lawsuit. But the ACLU also joined to support the state intervening on behalf of Common Cause, Out for Justice, and some individual voters who are concerned about their security. And thus far, the case in Maryland is fully briefed, and we're awaiting a court decision. Could come any day now. But thus far, the DOJ has been on an uninterrupted losing streak in these cases. All 8 courts that have reached decision on these cases have rejected the cases and dismissed them. So we're pretty optimistic that that the DOJ is not going to get our Maryland voter data either.
Perfect. So I am going to move into questions. And the first one, these are in no particular order, but it is one that I'm most interested in, which is the Challenger and Watcher program. I know that every election cycle, we always hear that there's going to be tons of challengers at the polls and they're going to make it impossible for people to vote. We also know that there was an update to some of the information. So can you tell us a little bit more about this Challenger update, and should people be worried that they will be challenged at the polls?
I'm assuming
Is that
that's
to
a
me?
Katie question.
Yeah, I think that's a Katie question.
Thank you, Nikki. Yeah, so there was a piece of legislation. It was House Bill 1001, if you were interested in following it. It is slated to take effect on June 1st, June 1st. I'm still behind in my days. And so what this essentially has done is place a role for the state administrator, the deputy state administrator, and the election director to maintain and keep the peace of polling places. And this is in addition to election judges that already are there. And so this gives the authority, if there is something that happens, the election director or the state can step in and create the peace if there's a breach of the peace, order arrests of people. And I really hope it never gets to this. But if there's a time that someone is interfering with the work of election judges, that is something that we'll be closely monitoring. And the other responsibility is that the local election director shall protect a challenger or watcher to allow the challenger and watcher to exercise their rights as a watcher. So the election director, so the challengers and watchers are encouraged to come to a polling place if you want to be there for, opening things, 30 minutes in advance of when the polls are going to open. So I think that's one of the bigger things. And then the other thing is, the key is, I guess, don't disturb the peace. But the challengers and watchers, they do have to provide signed certificates to the election directors before going to the polls. So that is something just to be really, just to make sure that there is order and security, and we are aware of who is coming in and out of the polling places during the day. Challengers and watchers, they have the right to be in the polling room. They can observe at a scanning unit. They can observe the check-in process. Chief judges can go with them if there's time and they're not busy, right, to go look at the scanning unit, to look at the how many voters have checked in on the poll book. I just encourage that there's a balance here where challengers and watchers need to be watchers and wait if there is a very busy situation with a lot of voters. So I think it's an exercise of patience on all accounts. And in addition, the challengers and watchers, they can't try to find out how voters are voting. They can't talk to voters in polling rooms, interfere with the election process, physically touch documents, or like engage in, like keep a voter from talking to an election judge. So again, it's an observer, a watcher. And so, again, we've always had challengers and watchers since I started in 2006 to now. Of course, there are a lot more watchers that, have the right to be there. But I think, it's really important just to make sure that everybody understands their role and, follows the proper protocol to notify, the election director when they're going to be in a place, and then also, let the voters just do their voting. So I'm happy to clarify or answer more questions. This is kind of new. We haven't had a chance to update our regulations about challengers and watchers yet because of this law. But we'll get there this summer.
So my next question is for Braden, which is, what is the minimum age that a support person needs to be? And then very close second is, don't election judges hold some rights? Hold on, let me click. Don't election judges hold some rights to determine who is eligible to vote? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. So with regard, starting with the support person, I'm not sure if there's an age requirement. I would assume that it's 18, and I could follow up with you on that. But with that in mind, I believe it's 18 years of age, and that person can be anyone from, like I said before, from a family, a friend, a coworker, as long as that support person isn't your employer or an agent of your union. They're able to provide, support through all aspects of that voting process, even if you're voting by mail. So they can provide support with helping you, fill out the mail-in ballot, fill out the mail-in ballot that's been sent to you online, print that out and get that in the mail for you. And I believe it's 18, but I can follow up with you after the fact on that, Nikki. And then could you remind me what the second question was?
As an election judge, don't election judges hold some rights to determine who is eligible to vote? And I think that's in regards to the intellectual disabilities portion.
Yeah, so when it comes to, capacity to vote, no, election judges can't make a determination, in the moment whether or not someone has the capacity to vote. As long as that individual is registered to vote, they would be allowed to vote. If there's any, questions about that, or if someone is asking you to prove, that you have the capacity to vote, that's definitely a red flag that I would reach out to someone like myself or raise the issue with SBE about. But when it comes to capacity in the moment or mental capacity, that is a separate determination that's made by a court to take away that right. So in the moment, if you're being questioned about that, that is definitely something that is a concern and isn't what election judges should be doing.
Thanks. So Debbie, I have a two-parter for you as well. They're unrelated though. So we talked a little bit about those who have been incarcerated or currently incarcerated and they're voting, but does that law hold over for people who have been convicted of buying or selling votes?
Mm. I don't know. Katie, do you know?
It's on the oath. I will have to check. It's not something I have right at my fingertips. Um,
It's a good question.
This
Trick
is a,
trick the
listen,
experts.
this is a league audience. You gotta be prepared. So with that, Debbie, could you talk to us a little bit more about voter intimidation? Has voter intimidation happened here in the state of Maryland? Yes, is the
Oh
answer.
yeah,
And
sure. I
can
mean,
you explain a little bit about what you know of
I
it?
mean, in actually, and I don't know, Katie, if you have more to say about this, but there was or maybe it was you, Nikki, that I think I was talking to about this. There was an incident in the one of the more recent elections where somebody was being very confrontational with a camera and sort of following people into the polling place with the camera or standing right outside, but very focused on recording people in a way that seemed very intimidating, and the election officials were called and ultimately I believe called the police. But I was wondering if that I know there's a new law that just took effect maybe today or yesterday that that gives state election officials and election poll people greater authority to direct police to make arrests in circumstances like that. And so I wondered if they were connected, if that law passed in response to something like that. But that was a sort of an incident that was very recent that stood out to me as something that was kind of intimidating.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I remember that was here in Annapolis. Um, So this one is for all three of you. So yay. It's about cell phone use in the polling place. And I think cell phone use has been controversial because technically we're not supposed to have them in the polling place, but the training manual for election judges say that it's a, kind of a gray area. Um, some people would feel, I know I would probably feel uncomfortable and a little bit intimidated if I thought somebody next to me, was taking pictures of, even if they were claiming it was of themselves, but really they could be taking pictures of anyone and anything. And then obviously you have to hold space for this, for the fact that some people might need their cell phones to look up candidate information or to remember, me alone, like I can hardly remember who I'm going to vote for sometimes. Um, so to Braden, like that in of itself could be accessibility issue. So could all three of you sort of touch on those cornerstones? And Katie, let's start with you and then Debbie and Braden.
Thank you. So we actually put out a new cell phone device sign for polling places and early voting centers. And I think you summarized it perfectly, Nikki. It says no cell phones or other electronic devices with an asterisk. And then there's a Comar citation, which I was getting ready to pull up here. A Comar citation that we provide because in Comar, generally devices may not be used. However, media can take pictures outside of, the area, there's certain circumstances that cell phones are needed. The other thing that is newer is because we have same day registration, and sometimes people have their proof of residency or their ID on their phone. And so there are those instances that they have to provide that to the election judges. And then to your point, Nikki, voters can still have a digital image of their own marked ballot. So we're trying to evolve while also maintaining the security of the system. The other big one that we have in regulation now is about translation services, because that's also a big thing on phones. So, generally no cell phones, but there's that asterisk. So, yeah.
Yeah, my experience of it has been that it has been I was thought it was a strict rule, and that with the exception that you could take a picture of your own ballot, it sounds like there's good reasons for it to perhaps be a little more nuanced, and maybe Braden has some more
I would
reasons
just
there.
Yeah, no, I would just echo, what's already been shared about using it to take a picture of your ballot. I can think of a situation where a voter might want to do that to zoom in on the ballot to gain, for better for visual impairment reasons and just to get a better understanding for what those questions are and where to mark it. And so for use like that, that's definitely, something that a voter could do while they're voting, just to provide some extra support with, knowing how to mark it and exactly where to fill in those circles, with the ink in the correct way. So that's definitely something that voters can make use of. But obviously, there's concerns about using it for improper reasons or filming other people. That's definitely not obviously what's allowed when using the cell phone in the polling locations. But I can definitely think of some voters that might need to zoom in and use it for access reasons like that.
Thanks, Braden. And I do want to point out that a couple of league members in the chat did say that Biden selling votes does make it. And I see that Katie also double checked. And so yes, so you can't do it. And don't do it. So before we close out, I know we're almost at time. I do just want to ask if there's anything else the three of you think is critical for the audience to know. And then I think one of the biggest questions we've been fielding, that I know of, is should people be scared this election, and what can we do to make them not feel as scared or as intimidated? And Debbie, yeah, go ahead.
I'll just say, there's never been a more important time than now to vote, get out there and vote, and don't let the noise intimidate you. Our rights are in peril in the world today, in the U.S. today, and it's just so important that each of us do what we can to hold the people in power to account.
Yeah. Katie?
Election officials are somewhat resilient. We have plan A's, plan B's, C, D's, and E's. And we have contacts, with law enforcement if we need it. We have a lot of safeguards in place. We ensure security at our polling places. We hire the best election judges that are, they're there on the front lines along with our local election officials. And so it takes a village to have an election. We rely on information if anybody hears anything so we can take action on it quickly. But we just please know that we are monitoring everything and anything possible to ensure that everything is safe and secure for the voters, no matter what method that you vote. And, if there is something that comes up, we will take action on it immediately. So that's my final pitch.
Braden?
Yeah, so just hopping off both those great points. I just want to highlight that there's a lot of support out there during the voting process. We in the state of Maryland, we have lots of different voting methods as well as strong protections for voters. And so if you have any concerns about getting that support or having assistance at the polls, I wouldn't let that bar you from going to the polls and asking for it, right? Because the most important thing is just to get there. And if you have questions, then the poll workers and the election judges are there to support and answer those questions. And someone like myself, if you have questions about accessibility needs, I'm also here to answer any questions about that. And so there really should be no reason, that would prevent you out of fear of not getting that support or fear of not having an accessible format to use to vote. It's out there and it's available, and there are lots of folks that are there ready to support and make that process accessible for you throughout the entire experience. So the best thing is to just go and try, and don't let anything, get in the way to the best of your ability. And then call in backup if need be.
Thank you so much. I do just want to say before we say goodbye to our panel that State Board of Elections, ACLU, Disability Rights Maryland, along with the League of Women Voters of Maryland and Common Cause Maryland, participate in what we call 866 Our Vote. with a direct line to Katherine and SBE, and we all get together on election day and we sit in what we call our little war room, and we all hang out for way too long with each other, and we monitor everything. We monitor all of the polling places. We monitor social media. Katie hears from us once every 7 minutes. It's great. And so just know that there are advocates and allies on your side as voters who are ready to take your call, emails, anything, and make sure that all problems get resolved. So with that, I want to thank Katherine, Debbie, and Braden for joining us this evening. If there are any questions, please feel free to send them my way and I will get them to our panelists. I will probably answer them myself because I'm that kid in class, but anything that I can pass on, I will. And be on the lookout for our follow-up email tomorrow with this recording, as well as some Know Your Rights sheets. So again, thank you to our panel and for everyone joining us. Good night.